So about 6 years ago, I made a video called Let's Talk About Growing Strange, where I talked pretty negatively about this stage. But that was 6 years ago, and the game has changed quite a bit since then. The video is quite outdated at this point for many reasons, but before we get into that, let's talk into what Growing Strange is. Yeah, I already covered that in my 6-year-old video, but again, that was a long time ago. Plus, I'm not gonna subject you to listen to my terrible old audio quality. Well, okay, I mean, I probably still need a new mic, but you know, anyways. Speaking of getting new things, this is currently the 10th anniversary with Wildcat slots and everything, so it's the best time for beginners to start a new save file, or for you to start a secondary save file. But to do that, you'd need a secondary device, and buying a whole phone would be too much. So you can just download LD Player, the free Android emulator that lets you play Battle Cats and many other mobile games on PC. It's like having a whole phone for free, and it runs fast and smooth. You're not starting a new save file? Well, you can also use LD Player's amazing features for your convenience. You can bind the buttons to your keyboard buttons or controllers for playing more conveniently. Want to farm tickets to prepare for the upcoming Superfest? Well, you can set up an action recording macro to auto-farm without any inputs. You can even run multiple instances of devices at once for multiple save files. Or you got any other mobile games that you might think might be better played on PC with these features? Then download LD Player now for free. Thanks to LD Player, now I can farm speed-ups while I sleep. Back to the video. Growing Strange is an event where you can farm Elder Cat fruit in Battle Cats. And this is one of its only one main source where you can repeatedly farm Elder Cat fruits and Elder Cat seeds. Growing Strange is only playable after you beat the main 49 chapters of Stories of Legend, as you're about to venture to Uncanny Legend, which are mainly focused on relic typing enemies. The Elder Cat fruits are usually used to evolve anti-relic units, mainly for the true forms of your Stories of Legend drop units as well as a couple of others. So with that, they expect you to farm Growing Strange first so that you may unlock new anti-relics before venturing deeper into Uncanny Legends. The main stage of Growing Strange, an Elder Secret, is actually a relatively simple stage. As you know, most other cat fruit stages are generally going to have enemies that represent the traits of the fruits that you're farming. For example, red fruits will have red enemies, blue fruits will have aliens, and purple fruits will have blacks. Yeah, it might sound weird that purple fruit doesn't have zombie enemies, but zombies didn't exist back when cat fruits were first introduced. But in Growing Strange, despite it being an event to farm relic fruits, you're not actually fighting relic enemies. Instead, you are fighting a mix of every traded enemies except for relic and Akus. That's right, you are not fighting relics at all. Most of the enemies here are relatively simple peons, but there are two main threats here, which is Berserkery and Metal One Horn. The Metal One Horn, being a metal enemy, which can only be damaged by critical hits, means that you are pretty much likely going to have to bring at least an anti-metal or a critical hitter unit. Metal One Horn's health is pretty weak, so any weak crit units would do, as long as they can do any crits. Berserkery, being a wave attacker, means you're going to need to bring an anti-red or anti-wave unit. He does spawn relatively later compared to everyone else, and therefore it is possible to exhaust all of the main peons first before dealing with Berserkery by itself. So, as long as you bring a good generalist attacker for the peons, an anti-metal or critical hitter, and something to deal with the Berserkery, then you're pretty much good to go. Okay, well, stage sounds simple enough, except that this is not where the Elder Cat fruit would actually drop. Instead, the stage that actually drops the Elder fruits are actually one of the 7 continuation stages. That's right, you have 7 different random continuation stages that you might get, each one representing each trait. After beating an Elder Secret, you will have to beat one of the 7 randomly selected stages to get your actual rewards. These are completely random, there's no pattern for it. You won't know what you're gonna get. This means that you have to build a lineup that is able to prepare for all 7 of those continuation stages if you want to secure a drop. The 7 stages featured are also quite a threat. They all have their own unique designs. Color of Blood, the red stage, features Cappies, Professor A, and Haki. If you don't have enough meat shields, the Cappies would push very hard as they have a huge amount of damage per hit. But the Professor A can also hit you if you push too far. Meanwhile, if you lure too close, then the Haki would hit your base. So you want to bring an anti-red rusher like Courier or anti-red tanker like Ro, or units that can deal with Professor A from far away. Fear of Flying, the floating stage, is probably one of the most quote-unquote generic stage. There's a big rush of little Bunbuns and Brawlos as the main pushing force, as well as pigeons for the supports that can do waves. And there's also the phase blocking your advances as a mid-range tanky enemy. However, this stage does last for quite a while as the little Bunbun waves persist for an extremely long amount of time. So you need to have a good check on your money and a good area attacker that can deal with the peon spam for a long while. Hearts of Darkness, the black stage, funnily enough, is probably the one that I dislike the most. It's not terribly hard, it's kind of just annoying. The existence of Razorback means that you are pretty much required to bring Bomber Cat to your lineup, the free unit that has a guaranteed chance to freeze black enemies. As without Bomber Cat, Razorback is a nearly unstoppable force. It is theoretically possible, but it would be very difficult to deal with Razorback without Bomber Cat. The Tacky can also snipe your higher range units off, making it harder for you to defend your front lines and potentially leaving your bomber cats exposed to the other peons. And if your bomber cats die, then the Razorback would push and it could be a potential death. Holy Rat, the Angel stage, is also quite an interesting one. The main enemies consist of Wing Piggy and Calamaria. Wing Piggy being a mid-range Omni-Strike unit with a deadly weaken ability, as well as Calamaria being an extremely powerful single target damager. You'd want to bring units with at least mid to high range to be able to outrange Wing Piggy's Omni-Strike, as well as Ramen Cat to stall the Wing Piggy and the Calamaria itself. Now, Galactic Threat, the Alien stage, is also personally one of my least favorite ones. Despite being relatively basic, the main threats of this stage are pretty high range enemies being Ursa Major as well as Elder Slot. This stage barely gives you any money, so spammable costly attacker might not cut it. It is very possible to have the enemies stack up and start snowballing you like crazy if you don't deal with them fast, so you'd want to bring high range Ubers to kill the Ursa Major without spending too much money. And then Seas of Death is the zombie stage. Since the enemies are all zombies that can revive, you'd want to bring zombie killer units to stop those revivals, especially due to the existence of Zamel and Coffin Soldiers, which have infinite revive count. It is possible to use fast units to slip your units behind Zamel and Coffin Soldiers without zombie killing them, but without zombie killers to permanently kill them for good, then it would be an extremely long battle at the very least. And then finally is Clash of Steel, the metal stage, which is probably a lot of people's worst nightmare. I'm pretty indifferent on it though. This one's just a metal stage. I mean, like, all of these enemies are pretty much the only metal enemies in the game at the time anyways. So bring a good crit units as well as proper meat shielding and generally you'd be good. I mean, you're still gonna have to bring a crit unit for the metal one horn in the first stage anyways, right? But even then, having all that in mind, creating a lineup that works for every single stage is where Growing Strange gets both interesting and maybe frustrating. Again, to guarantee a drop, you have to make a lineup that is strong enough to deal with not 7, but 8 stages, as you also have to deal with the first stage. So generally, there's 2 ways that this can go. One is that you can make a lineup that tries to tackle every stage, but making a lineup that is too unfocused on any of them in particular, you could end up struggling in majority of the stages you get, as you are just barely strong enough to deal with the stages. So alternatively, you can also try to only focus on, let's just say, 5 out of the 7 continuation stages. This would allow you to build a lineup that is more effective on those 5 stages, and therefore you'd have a much easier time if you get those stages. If you get the other 2 stages, then you'll just have to accept your loss. And that's where Growing Strange could potentially get pretty frustrating for players, as due to RNG to the continuation stages, if you just get unlucky, then you could just get screwed over. Not to mention that these continuation stages don't allow for hard restart. If you don't know, on any stages that are not marked as no continues, you could force close your game when you're about to lose, and when you reopen it, it would reset you back to the beginning of the stage without consuming any energy. However, this is not the case for continuation stages. Another problem with Growing Strange is that the main stage is 300 energy cost, which is quite high compared to the normal cat fruit farming stages, which are 200. To make things worse, while the stage is guaranteed at least a seed to drop, it only have a 1% chance to drop the fruits. You need 5 seeds to get the fruit, and most units that requires elder fruits to evolve uses 1 or 2 fruits, so you'd want to win at least 5 times to evolve a unit. These problems combined can create a fairly frustrating experience for a lot of players, and these were my main complaints that I had on my video 6 years ago. Except that I kind of changed my mind on a couple of these points. For one, I was under the impression that there's going to be a lot of units that would require elder fruits to evolve in the future. At the time, the stage was very new, so I wasn't really sure on where they're going with this. But actually, it's very rare for units to require elder fruits, even now. So aside from true forming specific units like Drama Cat's the Slapsticks or Awakening Mina and Ururun, you don't actually have to farm the stage that terribly much. Plus, unlike other fruits that might require 3 to 7 to 30 fruits to farm, like I said, most units only require 1 elder fruit. There's only very few units that even requires 2. After getting a couple of fruits for whatever you want to evolve, you pretty much don't need to touch Growing Strange ever again. Also, the 300 energy cost is actually not that bad anymore due to the introductions of leaderships. That's right, we didn't have leaderships back when the stage first comes out. Growing Strange was first released on update 7.0, meanwhile the leadership update is update 8.2. Leadership is an item which allows you to store charges for energy refills, making it easier to farm a stage multiple times in a row. Then of course, one of the biggest and most direct change of all, that really makes the stage more bearable, is the fact that Growing Strange was actually straight up nerfed. Version 7.5 and version 8.0 actually changed Growing Strange. Well, version 7.5 doesn't have that big of a change. The only thing it changes is that in the first stage, an Elder Secret, they swap a Calamari into a Moth. That's why if you see older footages of Growing Strange, you might see Calamari instead of Moth, and you might wonder on why that is. Well, again, this one isn't really that big of a change, because both of these enemies are pretty annoying. Calamari is annoying because of its high range and extremely potent ability to weaken your units, while Moth is easier to target due to its lower range, but has higher damage. Version 8.0 is where they did quite a lot of changes to the continuation stages of Growing Strange. A lot of the continuation stages got nerfed here. For example, in Color of Blood, the Professor A used to be at 150% magnification, but is now at 100. And there used to be 4 Cappies, and now there's only 3. In Fear of Flyings, the Little Bunbun's magnification was 1300% and is now reduced to 1000%. And the Pigeons, despite being increased in magnification, is now reduced in numbers. Hearts of Darkness also reduced the Tackies from 3 to 2, and the magnification of the Razorback was reduced from 150 to 100%. Holy Rat now has limited Gabriel spawn, and the 2 Chick-fil-A's are now reduced to 1. Galactic Threat, only remove 1 Scissoroos, I guess. Seas of Death reduces all of their enemy amounts, and finally Clash of Steel also reduces their Metal Doges and Metal One-Horns. So yeah, these changes are actually pretty significant. I'm pretty sure this is one of the earliest instances of Ponos actually nerfing stages. This is extremely rare for Ponos to do. Even nowadays, Ponos don't really do that. They have made some questionable changes like nerfing EOC Korea, for example, or nerfing Collapse Checker for the 10th time in a row for some reason. But for the most part, nerfing stages is something that is definitely very uncommon. So for Ponos to actually nerf Growing Strange this hard, maybe they did realize that they might have taken Growing Strange a little bit too far and was making a lot of continuation stages too hard. But yeah, since these are now actually better balanced, Growing Strange actually becomes a pretty interesting stage. Now it's not that terribly frustrating or unrealistic to create a lineup that can cover most stages. It is actually much more realistic to create a lineup for all of the stages, and it is much more doable even without Ubers. I mean, back then when players want to do it without Ubers, players would pretty much have to rely on cyber stacking for essentially half of the stages. But now, even doing Growing Strange without Ubers or without cyber stacking is actually very feasible. Maybe it is still somewhat challenging to want to cover every single continuation stages, but with good Ubers, is it really not that bad? On worst case scenario, maybe you can cover up 6 out of the 7 continuation stages, and you'll be able to slot in 1 or 2 more units that can help really well on the other continuation stages. And since you're only going to potentially lose on 1, then you are not as likely to get screwed up by RNG. It's possible, but it's 1 out of 7, and that's half of 2 out of 7. It is much less likely. Aside from the nerf itself, nowadays we have just generally a lot more options due to new units and power creeps and stuff. Not only the obvious power creep like Courier Cat, but even something as simple as the addition of new gacha units like Wushu Cat. Yeah, Wushu Cat actually comes very late into Growing Strange. Growing Strange appears in version 7.0 on 2018. Meanwhile, Wushu Cat appears on version 9.0 on November 2019, 1.5 years after Growing Strange. And the true form at 2021, after another 1.5 years. Still waiting for the talents, by the way. Wushu is an anti-zombie meat shield, which allows not only for dealing with the zombie stage much easier, but is also able to consistently zombie kill the Zamel to stop it from reviving. This is just one of the many things added in the game that helps on farming Growing Strange much easier. We also just generally have more true forms and more talents and much better cast of Ubers. Most great generic generalist Ubers would cover Fear of Flying, Galactic Threat, and Holy Rat very well, especially if your Ubers are LD. For Holy Rat, just having Ramen Cat and any good generalist Uber works very well. For Seas of Death, Wushu spam as well as any spammable attacker would be able to deal with it fairly simple. Hearts of Darkness still forces you to bring Bomber, but with the addition of units like Courier Cat and other anti-black choices, it is much more manageable. Speaking of Courier, Color of Blood also gets countered by Courier, and it is countered even especially harder if you're bringing Rogue Cat, which can actually pretty much solo the stage if you're using the Breaker Blast cannon. Clash of Steel is also now more doable with Catasaurus' new talents as well as new anti-metal choices. But even if you're worried about RNG screwing you over, the nerf version of Clash of Steel is actually doable with just bringing Waitress as your main critical hitter units, and she has a guaranteed crit chance. So yeah, Growing Strange is now much more manageable, and it's not really that frustrating to fight against nowadays. In fact, I would even argue that maybe it is somewhat fun in a way to build a lineup like that. I mean, sure, there are some improvements to be made, but I think most of the complaints are pretty minor, all things considered. A pretty big problem, I think, is how it's nearly impossible to create a good lineup if you're playing it blind. I mean, sure, most of Battle Cats in general would be difficult going in blind, but you can at least just go in once to scout, and if you lose lose, you know what you're up against. That's for most stages, right? But for Growing Strange, since the continuation stages are very RNG based, it's nearly impossible to know what you're up against and create a good lineup in just one run. You either have to be guessing or bringing in super broken Ubers, or well, look up a guide online. But I'd say this feels like more of the fault of the game as a whole rather than the fault of the stage itself, if that makes sense. I personally don't have a problem with that because I always research what I'm up against, but I can imagine people who aren't used to looking up stages would be pretty annoyed by it. And aside from that, my biggest gripe from 6 years ago that I think I still stand on is that Growing Strange took away the potential of having awakening stages where you refight the stories of legend cats. I thought that the idea of having to refight the legends on the special awakening stages where you have to fight the awakened version of the stories of legend units would be way cooler, but instead we get a farming stage, which is kinda lame. Oh well, space-time distortion will do for now. I actually kind of appreciate Growing Strange quite a lot nowadays for being very unique on its gimmick. I mean sure, there are some events with like multiple random continuation stages, stuff like Proving Grounds or the continuation of Gauntlet stages, but Growing Strange is the only one that I think really properly implements this multi-continuation gimmick stage in such a really good way. Just the idea of having to build a lineup for like 8 different stages and none of them being a complete joke is a very interesting concept that doesn't really exist in most other parts of the game. Despite the nerf, a lot of these stages are actually pretty specific in what they demand from you, and so you actually have to put quite a decent amount of thought into it and actually made a proper lineup. So yeah, despite what I said 6 years ago, I changed my mind. I actually think that Growing Strange is a perfectly fine stage. I mean, back then, Growing Strange being one of the worst stages in the game was actually a very popular opinion. Even before I made a video about it, most of the community finds Growing Strange to be way too hard for its own good. But some people today might still feel that way, and I feel like I'm somewhat responsible for souring the opinion of Growing Strange, especially with how popular the previous Growing Strange video was, so I felt kinda bad. Maybe that's partially on why I want to make this video, but oh well, it is what it is. I mean, I've probably also doomed a lot of players in Empire of Cats Moon 3 with my grossest strat video anyways. But yeah, that was before the nerf and everything, and after the nerf, the stage actually becomes bearable and pretty fun. Also, some of you already know this, but if you like the Growing Strange nerf, be sure to thank Sean. I'm too lazy to retell the context of what this means. I've told the story many times in the past, so if you know, you know. Also, I didn't get quite into like how to beat Growing Strange or like tips and tricks to create the perfect lineup or whatever, because I think it would be better if its own separate video, you know? So yeah, anyways, that's about it for Growing Strange. Do you have any thoughts or questions? Comment them down below. Do you perhaps still hate Growing Strange, or do you like Growing Strange? What's your lineup in Growing Strange actually? After all, this is one of those stages where you have a huge amount of potential correct answers, especially depending on which Ubers you're bringing. Which was your least favorite continuation stage? Well, okay, I know most of you are gonna say Clash of Steel, but anyways, that is all for now, and I'll catch you another time. See ya!